Welcome to another edition of Horner's Corner. I'm your host, Ray Horner, and as you know, with Horner's Corner, we talk about Akron's greats, and today we're going to sit down and have a lot of sports talk, but also some faith talk, and he certainly is one of Akron's greats, in my opinion. Started well before I ever came to Akron, over 25 years ago. When I accepted the job to come to Akron, I started reading Terry Pluto's writings. Couldn't wait to meet him personally, coming in from Pennsylvania. Got a chance to meet Terry right away, and we've had a relationship in the media ever since. Terry Pluto is our guest this month on Horner's Corner. Terry, thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to do it, Ray.
All right, so let's go back to the beginning with your writings. Obviously Cleveland Benedictine, Cleveland State. Are you doing what you've always wanted to do?
Pretty close. I think when I was in high school for a while and even a little bit at college, I wanted to write novels. And what I discovered later on too was that one of the hard things about doing fiction as opposed to working in, whether it's newspapers or whatever, every day I go to the ballpark, my plot is already unfolding in front of me. In other words, you got a winner, you got a loser, somebody's happy, somebody's sad, all that. And it's almost like somebody hands you a coloring book and you just got to color within the lines. When they say, okay, write a novel, it's like the dreaded thing. You come back from summer vacation to school and say, write 2 pages about anything you want. And you go, I don't know what to write. I mean, I really don't. Now, if you say write 2 pages on why you can't stand your sister, you might have a better opportunity. And so that was one of the things I discovered when I did publish a couple of short stories and things like that, but developing plot and moving it along was hard. Whereas with sports, the great thing is I always tell people, I don't love sports, I like sports. I love to write. And the best broadcasters are people who love broadcasting. They like sports, but they really like broadcasting, because if you don't love writing, then you shouldn't be a writer. If you in it just to do sports, well then fine, go coach, go do something else. Because really your job is to write and to tell the story. The same thing if you're a broadcaster. You better realize you're going to spend a lot more time in the studio preparing things than you are watching a game going, hey, what a great play. Those are things that I think people miss a lot. And just because you can name every pennant winner since 1917 doesn't make you good at sports media. Because what we're really here for is to tell stories. And that's where I decided I wanted to be a novelist, which was telling stories like, okay, I'll go to where there's the plot and I'll color within the lines. And so that, I think, is the reason I worked more towards journalism and that, just because it was more of a comfort zone. But I really just wanted to be a really good writer. That was my goal.
Well, we're going to talk about some of those writings and some of those iconic books that he's put together. We know you, of course, from the Akron Beacon Journal. I think 2007, you went over to the Plain Dealer. But take us back to the infant stages. You get your first start into, quote, writing and sports writing. What were some of those memorable moments as you first got into the industry, Terry?
Well, one of the things that I had to deal with, and it helped me in some ways. I was totally naive because I had no background in it, whatever. For example, I've written more books than were in my house growing up. My father worked at a food warehouse, old Fisher Fazio's. My mother worked at Parmatown Lanes and some other bowling alleys. Later on, she actually started the bowling program at Tri-C West Junior College. She was the first author. They had no bowling textbook. She put together like 30 pages on a mimeograph machine on how to score and bowling and that, and she coached that. But the idea, I think, for my parents that I actually would be a writer, because they were first generation, both Slovaks on both sides, was hard for them to fathom. And for me, I had an English teacher at Benedictine, a guy named Jim Muth, and he recognized some writing talent in me and kept telling me you could do this, and he got me on the newspaper, and suddenly I realized that a lot of the guys on the athletic teams, I was a bad athlete, but I was on a couple of teams, were actually reading my stuff because they were looking to see if nothing else that their name was in it. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool, that, whereas otherwise, I was kind of like just some insect that crawled across the table while they're having lunch. Yeah, there he goes, but it doesn't really matter. And so that, I think, helped my ego. And also, we're always, I think, especially in our teens looking for, what am I good at? And even better, what am I good at that I kind of like? And so that was a blessing of being able to write. I kind of liked writing, and turned out I was pretty good at it naturally. And the teacher, Jim Youth, saw this in me, and I often wonder, had I not gone to Benedictine, and had I not had him in class, would I be a writer? Because I needed somebody to tell me this at that point. And he did. And so I remember one time, like I think in the middle of my sophomore year, he hands me a book. It was called The Greatest Thing Since Sliced Bread by Don Robertson, who was known primarily in Cleveland as a sort of a curmudgeon columnist for both the Plain Dealer and the Old Cleveland Press. He would bounce back and forth. He would anger his bosses at one place and hop to the other paper, and then he would come back. And of course, what am I to talk about? I went from the Plain Dealer to the Beacon Journal back to the Plain Dealer, so I followed Don's lead. But he also wrote novels. So Jim Youth, the teacher, hands me a book called The Greatest Thing Since Sliced Bread, which is about a kid growing up in Cleveland right after World War II, and it had to do with where the east side of Cleveland was becoming integrated. They were one of the last white families there as the African Americans moved in, and his mother had died, and all this kind of family drama stuff. And so I'm reading, I go, this is really good. And at that point, it's almost like I just sort of thought writers lived in New York or LA. You know, they don't live in Northeast Ohio. And the teacher said, you know, you could do something like this. I mean, this guy's from here. He went to Cleveland East High is where he went to. And so it began getting me thinking more than beyond, okay, I'm going to write a story about the Benedictine JV football team, to other kinds of things, you know, creative writing and that. So I was just so blessed to have a teacher that lit the flame, and then to be able to do it, and do it well. And boy, some of the early stuff I read was not well, but I guess was better than the other kids. It's embarrassing, but I'm always glad about that.
You also, as we'll move on with our conversation, Terry mentioned the bowling background. I remember seeing some video and some writings of, I don't know how early that was in your career, but you did a lot of coverage of the bowling championships right here in the Akron.
From Akron, yeah. In fact, my mother got me, I think it was called the Kegler. It's like a weekly thing in bowling publication in Northeast Ohio. And so I would write up some bowling scores and things for them. And I hung around the bowling alley a lot just because that's where she worked. I remember the first job I ever got paid for was cleaning bowling shoes. I don't suggest this because it's kind of like, you know, when people take them off, it smells like they've had them on. And, you know, you had by the way, it was way before anybody wore gloves or anything. So you had them on, you just sprayed them and kind of wiped it down and, you know, hope you didn't come down with the plague when it was over. And so worked there, and I also worked at the food warehouse with my father in the summer. Best things. I mean, the world of work, to see this is, you know, what the working class does. And especially at the food warehouse where it's like, okay, you know, these guys, whether loading, unloading cases and that, they tend to have me more like, I was always in inventory counting up cases of tomato sauce or whatever it is. But I would watch these guys on their break, and they all had copies of, remember this is up in Cleveland, the Plain Dealer primarily, the morning paper, and they're reading it and they wanted to see what Hal Lebowitz or Chuck Keaton, Danny Coghlan, what these guys are writing about. And I thought, man, it would be so cool if one day I could earn my living with a typewriter, that's how far back it was, and that these guys would want to read my stories. And to this day, when I write, I think about my father, I think about those type of folks. And so make sure you're writing it not to show off how smart you are or to write for your peers to see that they think you're clever, but writing about, okay, these are the customers. These are the people, whether they're online now or in the paper, and they're the sports fans and that. So tell a story that they could understand in a way that makes sense to them, not something that points attention to you as a writer.
That's one thing I can always say about Terry. I enjoy his writings because he does write it for the fan. This month's guest on Horner's Corner is award-winning columnist and writer Terry Pluto with us. Terry, there's so many avenues that I wanted to go in with you with this discussion, so I'm going to prioritize because we could go for a couple of hours with our conversations, but in sports, and then I want to get to your faith writings in a couple of moments as well. But in sports, you saw the 90s baseball teams there in Cleveland. You and I together actually went through the LeBron saga from high school to his antics with the Cavaliers and taking them to an NBA title. We've seen all the Browns' ups and downs. Some of the things that stand out to you, I mean, those 90s baseball teams were probably something else to write about.
Yeah, probably my favorite was the rise of the old Tribe, because my father played 1 year of minor league baseball and actually was a part-time scout for the Tribe for a number of years. They had a bunch of these guys, and really what you did, you signed a contract. You were called a bird dog. They gave you a season's pass for 2 people can get into the stadium for 50 cents each. Like what a thing. The stadium was wide open. It was not like, this is the 60s and 70s and early 80s. And then if you found a player, I think you got a bonus of $2,500 if he made it to AA or something. So my dad recommended one guy, Rich Rollins, that the Cleveland didn't sign. He ended up signing with the Twins and played 10 years in the big leagues. My dad goes, he was my prized prospect. But so we would go to all these games, down the old lakefront, and watched all this bad baseball. So when they went to the new ballpark, first of all, it was like you went from indoor plumbing to like, my goodness, there's electricity and running water. You couldn't even believe, what a difference it was. And then secondly, here was this powerhouse team that Hank Peters first started to put together, and then John Hart. So not only were they good, remember they used to have welcome to the show, and they hit a ton of home runs. The fans, everything came together at that moment. The Browns had moved. There was nobody else. The Cavs were mediocre, and they were the only show in town, and they hit a ton of home runs, and they had come out of, basically, with Curse of Rocky Colavito, loving look at a 31-year slump. I mean, basically, where they were not in contention for over 3 decades to this. So that was so much fun. And probably my favorite game I went to was in Seattle when they clinched they beat the Mariners to go to the World Series in '95, because I just figured I was never going to see them go to the World Series. And Dennis Martinez had pitched that day, and I remember about 3 or 4 hours before the game, Sheldon Oker from the Beacon Journal and I were in the lobby of the hotel. I think it was the Seattle Hilton. And Dennis is down there. And I had kind of a special thing with Dennis, because my first major league job, I worked for the Baltimore Evening Sun in 1979. Dennis pitched for them, was a young pitcher, so I knew him from way back then. And Dennis is nervous as all get out. I mean, he's pacing up and down in the lobby of the hotel. This is several hours before he goes, I hope I'm not out there by myself. I hope these guys are ready for this big game. I mean, I don't know. They got Randy Johnson pitching. And Sheldon and I are looking at him thinking, this guy's a basket case. I mean, if he gets through 4 innings. Then he does something cool. He reaches in his pocket, he pulls out this little coin, and he shows Sheldon and I, goes, look at this, what is it? I said, he goes, it's a golden Buckeye. Bob Feller gave me a golden Buckeye for good luck. I did not have the heart to tell him that Feller's only, postseason game, 1948. He lost. But that's... And then, of course, Dennis went out there and pitched this brilliant game, and that's where Kenny Lofton scored from second base on a pass ball, and they won. And again, Randy Johnson is, at the height of his power, striking out about 12 guys per 9 innings. Dennis is finessing it, and I remember sitting there going, this is just so amazing. And at that point, my father had already suffered a stroke and was living in Florida. I don't really know when he watched TV what he really was able to comprehend all that was happening. And I just wish he, could have seen that, because it was something that we talked about as kids. And the idea now of what I just told you there, see, those are stories. Mm-hmm. It's not so much about hits and runs and that, and then the way the fans were able to, Earl Hershiser told me, he was on that team, that it reminded him like a college town, a big football game in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, or somewhere else. Everybody had the old Chief Wahoo or the different signs in front of their yards. After the big games they won, people blowing their horns and heading out. It was just, it was new, it was fresh, and it was so unique. It was just something that probably won't be replicated again in Cleveland because of the Browns leaving, the new stadium coming, sports economics for a little while favored places like Cleveland, Baltimore, and a few others, and then how dramatic many of their wins were back then.
How about the LeBron thing? And again, I mentioned that you and I got to know each other pretty well during the LeBron. I did a lot of the games. You were doing the columns on the team. And then he gets drafted by our Cavaliers, and you saw the good and bad with the Cavaliers through the writings, and all of a sudden this team, originally a Z's team, and then it becomes LeBron's team. That had to be a lot of fun going all over with that team.
Drew Joyce, the second, always talked about how he's totally ill-equipped to coach where this LeBron bubble rose up. And because none of us knew what was coming. I think that was true in the media, where at that point, you were getting as many reporters at a St. V game or more than you were at a Cavs game, because I went to both. LeBron went from this high school kid to basically, by the time in the middle of his junior year, he's almost a corporation. Already the handlers would come in. And given all that, I always thought it was amazing this whole thing didn't go sideways with him. I mean, it was all set up for a big flame out, but it didn't. But I had trouble sometimes figuring out how the heck do you write this? They're traveling, high school team traveling all over the country. Now, it's done a lot now, but it wasn't back then. The team was all basically from Akron, a couple other kids from Northeast Ohio, but it wasn't like some of these prep school elites where they bring kids in from all over the country. And so it was fun to write it, but it was a real challenge. And then he gets drafted by the Cavaliers, and it turned out, he ends up being the guy that finally delivers a title to Cleveland. And his second go-around. That's what you talk about, story, power. LeBron comes home, almost to quote, make things right, because even if it was okay for him to go to Miami, in his mind, he knew announcing it on ESPN and all that stuff was garbage. Never should have been done. Because the second time when he comes here, remember, he does his own essay in Sports Illustrated where he can just lay out everything. That's one of the things I've always admired about LeBron is he figures out things as he goes along. Even if he isn't willing publicly to admit mistakes very often, his behavior changes. And that's helped him. The fact that, we're going in year 20 of his career, and he has set every record for longevity.
Right.
And that this guy, he's a billionaire. So he's clearly not driven by money as a player. He's driven by wanting to be the greatest ever. That's hard for a lot of players after you've kind of made your cash and made your way and you made your all-star teams, just keep putting your body through all of that. And it's just been a remarkable thing to watch from the beginning. The first time I saw him, I didn't see him as a freshman. I forgot what was going on with me then, but I didn't see him. But in the summer, Keith Dambrot called me. We were talking about some stuff. He goes, "You got to really come down and see him." And he's scrimmaging here, and he had just come back from the 5-star camp where he after his freshman year was already playing with the college kids, and they were talking about. But I just remember LeBron. I saw a little bit of an end of a pickup game. Then he sits down and he's sitting in the stands, and I went over to talk to him, and he's like eating Skittles. He's this kid, he just is, and. Just to watch his growth, and single mom, projects of Akron, and by at that point I was already doing prison ministry, and really his background is very similar to a lot of the guys that I would run into at Summit County Jail. The odds were stacked against him, and it was set up for him to have a big fall because oftentimes that happened, and it never happened. And that is, I could. Sometimes LeBron goes on some strange political riffs or whatever, but given all that, how he has conducted himself, what he's done in this community, it's beyond admirable. It really is.
Terry Pluto is our guest this month on Horner's Corner. Terry has put together a whole bookshelf full of great reads, and just like his column writing, they're very easy to read, informative, educational, takes us back to those times very well. You did a book on LeBron, you did a book with Tom Hamilton, but you did a book, and I wanted you to spend a couple of minutes here with one of our good friends who passed away a couple of years ago, and that's Joe Tate. And I know you spent some time, you and I even talked, I think on the show or certainly on the phone together after he had passed away, and you spent a lot of time with Joe and put together this book. I thought maybe you could reflect a little bit on that.
Well, Joe became one of my closest friends in the world, if not my best friend. And going back to when I was with the Plain Dealer the first time, and I covered baseball there, 80 through 84, Joe was doing TV with Bruce Drennan back then, and that kind of drove him. They were friends, but drove him nuts because Drennan was such a character. By the way, Joe's approach to broadcasting, we were talking, is very similar to my view of writing. He liked sports but loved broadcasting. That's why he would go do some girls' game in Medina or somewhere else. To him, it was all, again, the storytelling.
Yeah.
Also, Joe knew that not only Gordon Gunn, the owner of the cast, who was blind, but he had many other blind readers that he would hear from. So he was always describing the colors and, you know, that view of things. And so Joe, I remember periodically would tell him, well, some other guy wants to do a book on me and I don't want to do it or whatever. And I'm like, well, then don't do it. I never asked him because I figured, well, I don't think he wants to do a book. But then after he retired, and a lot of what people don't know, Joe had some health problems, but also his wife Jeannie had Alzheimer's, and Joe was battling to keep her at home. I don't know how long, how able he was to keep her at home that long. So he decided, he called me, I think I want to do a book. You want to do a book with me? I'm like, okay. I said, I'm going to write it. And he go, I don't care what you do, you just do it.
You do a good Joe Tate, by the way.
Right, so we did it. I listened to it for 30 years or whatever, like 1980 till he passed away. I think it was 3 years ago now. So I go to his house, and he comes out with all these boxes of stories about him at Monmouth College, and he had his like elementary school report cards. I said, Joe, did you just save everything? So then it was kind of going through what all this stuff was. I mean, it was perfect. I didn't have to do any research. He had it all right there. And so I really got a kick out of it. And then I said, no, Joe, you got to go out and promote it. Because he knew a couple times I'd done books with celebrities, and they didn't really do a very good job helping me to sell.
Okay.
So that was part of the deal. And he did every library, every bookstore. And see, he found that Jeannie liked going. So Jeannie would kind of go and sit by him, and they might get her something, but she just kind of met people and seemed like in a real peaceful place there. So that really worked out.
Nice.
For us. And it was fun to do that. Hamilton and I have gotten to be really close friends. And so that was very the same model, but both times the books were written not in their voice, first person, but third person, me there with a lot of quotes from them, because I just think I wanted to tell their story. It's hard. I've done a couple books in other people's voices, first person. It's hard to do it that way. So, but those are all challenging things of storytelling. And the book sold well, and I was just so happy that Joe found something he could do with Jeannie probably for a year and a half afterwards. He was making appearances with that when they were going through some real tough times otherwise.
That's up there with my favorite books by you. My other one, and I think I've told you, is your ABA book. I just absolutely love that book because I was a fan of the ABA, to be quite honestly. But do you, and they're all special to you, I'm sure, but do you have one that's at the top of the ladder that you sit back and say, this is my favorite that I've been able to put together?
Yeah, it's a book called Our Tribe, about the tribe. Basically, I wrote it after the 97 World Series, but it's a look back at different Cleveland Indians teams. but I wrote it when my dad was dying of a stroke. And it was very therapeutic for me. I'd sit, because he lived in Sarasota, my brother was down there, we had home health care coming in, but I was going down any time between 3 and 5 days a week, totally just get all the home health care people all the time off, and it was just something I was writing at night and things. So that, and what the nice thing about that book is I still have this whole box of over 500 letters, because this came out in the late 90s, as before email got going or anything, of people saying, I read that book and it reminded me of my grandparent, it made me call my aunt. You know, it just, because I talked a little bit about like going to those games at the old stadium and what it was like for that. So that one has tremendous meaning because of when I was doing it. And when my father passed away from the stroke, I wrote a column for the next day, and I mean, but how could you do that? And I said it was, you know, it was a therapeutic thing for me.
Mm-hmm. You've touched a lot of people through your writings, whether it's the books or the columns, and also with your faith writings, which are terrific. And they're very important to Terry, folks. I know when you went from the Akron Beacon Journal to the Plain Dealer back, one of the things you told me on my show is you wanted to make sure that you could continue your faith writing. So
yeah, I got it in writing.
Talk about that aspect and why that's so important to you.
Well, the column started at the Beacon Journal in 2000. Jan Leach was the editor back then, and Regina Brett had been there, like our star Metro columnist or whatever, and she had gone up to the Plain Dealer. So Jan took Roberta and I to breakfast, my wife Roberta, because she's been a partner, and she's every book, first of all, she reads about 90% of my stories before they go in online, because I make so many mistakes. She's edited all the books, first edited on them, transcribed tapes. I mean, we've been married 46 years, and we started dating like, almost 50 years ago. So anyway, talking to Jan about this, and she mentioned how, did I want to go and become a general columnist? And I had watched sports writers do it. For the most part, it failed. Because part of like being a general columnist is that blank sheet of paper suddenly, right? You could write about anything. Well, what should I write about? Well, about anything. Whereas if you're a sports columnist, I always say, if you're interviewing somebody for a job like what I have, I would bring them in and say, you got 2 hours to write a column. Let's see what you could do. Because if you have the entire world of sports from high schools to the pros to whatever, and you can't come up with something in 2 hours, you got winners, you got losers, you got people who are angry, you got women's sports, you got men's sports, you had everything. And so there's tension built into sports, there's drama, and a built-in audience even there who wants to know this. So I said, no, that doesn't work. And we got on the subject of, I've told her some prison ministry stories that we were doing, because Roberta's been my partner in that, and some others. And she says, well, what do you think of back then they actually had a religion page. And I said, well, Jim Carney does tremendous features on, local churches or charities. I said, it's really good. I said, but you run these crummy lawyer columns, and they're all, gay bishops or aborted, they're all the hot button. And I said, they're politics. They're not even faith.
Right. And
she said, well, what would you write about? And I said, well, suppose, for example, when I was praying during my dad's stroke, it felt like this prayers are bouncing off the ceiling or whatever. And then how dealing with tragedies or things that happen in your life. And people forget, for example, they always talk about how comforting Psalm 23 is, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. But right in the middle is, though I walk through the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Who wants to walk through the shadow of death? And but that's built right in the middle. It doesn't say when, it doesn't say if, it says though or when. And we all will be walking through the shadow of, the valley of shadow of death at some point. So it's like a friend of mine, Bishop Joey Johnson, from real close friend of mine from House of the Lord, used to say, especially he said, the thing about black preaching is you start with suffering, you end with celebration. You start, he goes, you want an audience, you start doing suffering. People are dealing with this or that. And so most of my columns begin with someone dealing with a problem. You know, and usually it's a story. If you look when Jesus would then want to get a message across, oh, you know, a man had 2 sons. And the first son said to the man, you know, Father, I know you want me to work in your field, but I don't feel like doing it today. I'm not going to do it. The second son said, I'm not, you know, I'll be there. Just tell me what time. I'm paraphrasing. And then, but it was the first son who went and the second son who promised who didn't. And he said, well, who did the will of the Father? And it's like, and everybody's sitting there, you could relate to that. We all have somebody in our family, promises big, delivers nothing. Some of us others are like, I'm not promising anything. In fact, the moral of the story is, you know, under promise and over deliver. You get more respect that way. So a lot of those techniques, biblical things from there, are things that I put into the faith column. So Jan asked me to write a couple of, Jan Leach did, of samples, so I did. And then I heard nothing for 6 months. I thought, well, that went well. And then she came up to me. I just let it go. And she said, I don't know where she just found them on her desk, and said, we're going to go with these. Let's see what happens. And so published them. And I think it helped because I had a name on the sports page. People were a little shocked, like, where's this coming from? Mm-hmm. But they were stories that back then was called, you know, everyday faith, you know, things that people deal with. You know, it's not about denominational spitball fights or any of that stuff. And so that became popular right away. I mean, they did get some pushback, but Jan just ignored it. And I mean, I used to say, I still once in a while say, all right, whether you're talking about a website or a newspaper, you got all this stuff in there. It's like you go, you know, to the buffet at Golden Corral or whatever. If you don't like to eat it, don't eat the beets. Eat something else. But don't like protest because they have beets available. Well, it's the same thing. You don't want to read it, don't read it. Yeah. Who says you have to?
That's right.
You know, there's a bunch of people I don't read, you know, that are in our paper, but it's not like I'm going in there and pounding on the doors. How can you run this guy's crap, you know? So we got kind of past that, and then when the Plain Dealer recruited me in 2007, the big thing is Deborah Adams Simmons was behind that, and she was had been at the Plain Dealer when I was there, and was always kind of a guardian angel for me in my career. So she was all good with that. But I did get it in writing because, you know, you never know who these people are. And then the phenomenal thing that happened, it kind of would get buried in the paper. It'd be hard to find. And I was only writing a couple times a month. It seemed like it sort of lost its steam and energy. And when the pandemic hit, then Tim Warsinski was an editor, and Chris Quinn, the big editor from Cleveland.com, said, can you write one of these every week? You know, they were looking for stuff, and they just thought, and so suddenly it went from, I mean, you could have 2 bloodhounds and a map, and you couldn't find it in the paper anywhere. It was like literally buried below the obits. And to now they put it on the front of the Metro section, which is your B section on Sundays, the big days. And it just developed this whole new audience starting in 2020, and I think it revived me. Also, but it's the hardest thing I write each week. It's not even close. Because that's a little bit of, well, write anything you want.
Right.
And now I've grabbed onto a couple of things of, like, every year I do advice to graduates, and because I just listen to these horrible, these graduation speeches by some, you know, some ditzy star getting $40,000 to come in and say, well, follow your dreams, and you want to make a difference in the world, and just do something you love. If you do something you love, you don't have to worry. I mean, what if you love, you know, eating cupcakes, sitting on the couch and watching TV? I don't think you're going to get paid for it. You know, and so I'm like, all right, let's just do some real things. And I talked about some of the mistakes I made early in my career, where I gravitated towards sort of the negative people because they seem cool, and watched them poison attitudes. So those are things that I really like, and a lot of my stuff comes from readers, and they write about things they're going through. So that's really helped me. But I'll tell you, some weeks it's hard because I'll go down the road. What am I going to do with this?
So you could tell, therapeutic, sports, personalities, friends. He's written about all of them, but you heard Terry Pluto's words. He loves to write. And he's been doing that since his high school days. Terry, thanks for joining us this month on Horner's Corner. Always good talking to you with you, my friend.
I appreciate it. It was fun, Ray.
There you go. Terry Pluto, this month's guest on Horner's Corner. I'm Ray Horner.